I thought they were really scary substances. I never used them when I was young. I had absorbed all the kind of propaganda that these were destroyers of young minds, that you would have a trip that you'd never come back from. So it was a kind of a surprise and a revelation to me when I learned that this scary substance that I'd been avoiding my whole life was being used to treat mental illness, not create it.
Hello and welcome to the Life Lessons podcast with me, Simon Mundy. This podcast has a simple mission: to have discussions that reveal something important about life and how best to live it. My guests range from the biggest sporting names on the planet through to neuroscientists, philosophers, psychologists, and world-renowned thinkers. We talk about things like how to skillfully relate to uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, the power of acceptance and psychological flexibility, how to get your circadian rhythms in sync to feel your best, right through to the nature of reality. These conversations and the bite-sized episodes have the power to change your life. "2023 has been described as the year of psychedelics, and as research into the incredible healing powers of substances such as magic mushrooms gains pace, I am thrilled to be joined by Michael Pollan, the author and journalist described as one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine. He is right at the forefront of the psychedelic renaissance. Michael's written 8 books, primarily about our relationship with nature and food, but more recently he's headed into the realm of psychedelics and other mind-altering substances, including coffee. In How to Change Your Mind, Michael researches how psychedelics, including psilocibin mushrooms, are being used to help people suffering from various mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety, PTSD, and addiction. The results have been staggering. That book has now been turned into a 4-part Netflix series of the same name, and it is highly recommended viewing. In February, Australia became the first country to officially recognise psychedelics as medicines, acknowledging that substances like magic mushrooms could help treatment-resistant conditions. The same is now true in a number of American states. So, psychedelic research is clearly a growing and interesting area and has the potential to help a lot of people who are suffering. That said, psychedelics are not to be taken lightly. They are extremely powerful substances that must be treated with respect. And that's why the work that is taking place in various universities and medical institutions around the world to explore how people can take part in psychedelic therapy safely is so important. In this episode, Michael and I explore how his books and Netflix series have played a pivotal role in changing how psychedelics are seen, as well as their potential to improve people's mental health and well-being, and how the worlds of science, medicine, and psychiatry are increasingly embracing psychedelics as a potential treatment. This was such a pleasure to record with Michael. I'm a huge fan of his work, and he is a lovely man to boot. I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation, and if you did and could share it, it would make a big difference, and I'd be very grateful. But first, here is Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. It really is. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Good to be here.
A little tired, I know. I know you've been putting in another epic shift today, so I'm very grateful that you've come on. And I've got to just start by saying it's my birthday tomorrow, and I can't think of any better way than to spend the last couple of hours of this particular year, I'm not going to give it away, than with you. I'm such a fan of your work, of your books, of your Netflix series. So it's just a joy. I don't want to wax too lyrical, but huge fan, hugely grateful. Lovely to see you.
Thank you. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Michael. You're the first to say it. That's very kind.
A little premature.
Now, you are best known really for being a prolific author, Michael, both in terms of volume as well as impact. And you were best known for your work on food, books like In Defense of Food, The Omnivore's Dilemma, etc., etc. But then latterly, you've carved out this new niche. It's not really a niche, but you've certainly cornered the market on mind-altering substances, on psychedelics, through your book, which I have here, How to Change Your Mind, which is also an outstanding, seminal Netflix series. And then as well, your more recent book, Your Mind on Plants. And we're going to focus really on this area. And I think the first place to start really would be that the state of play with the mental health space as it is right now, in terms of psychotherapy, in terms of antidepressants, etc., etc. And it's a field that hasn't really moved hugely forward relative to other fields of science and well-being.
Yes, and relative to the scope of the problem,
Yeah.
I mean, the pandemic has made things a lot worse, of course, but we do have an epidemic of mental illness of many kinds, especially depression. And I see it. I'm on a college campus. I teach, and the incidence of mental disorders among students and the amount of services they require. But what you say about the field is true, and I didn't really know much about this until I started writing How to Change Your Mind. You know, I kind of expected a lot of pushback from psychiatry, the field of psychiatry, to a book that was pointing towards psychedelics as a possible treatment. And I got just the opposite. And it really surprised me that there was incredible openness on the part of mainstream psychiatry and psychology. And the reason I came to understand from talking to psychiatrists was that they are desperate for new tools, that there's a pretty widespread recognition among psychiatrists and psychologists that the tools they have are inadequate. By and large, for depression and anxiety and OCD and things like that, they have SSRI antidepressants, and that these are not working as well as they once did. There's this phenomenon where new drugs work better because of the placebo effect. And as time has gone on, the effectiveness of antidepressants has waned, but also the fact that people don't like taking them. They're very hard to get off. They interfere. People put on weight, interferes with their libido. People don't like taking them, and they're only marginally effective. I think when they were actually first trialed, they only did like 2 percentage points better than placebo in head-to-head drug trials. That's not that impressive. So, if you compare psychiatry to any other branch of medicine over the last, say, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years, compare it to cardiology or oncology or infectious disease, much less has been achieved. We're not saving lives at the same rate. We're not innovating at the same rate as we have been in these other fields. And this is not a secret, and this is not meant as a criticism of the field. The brain is a lot harder to deal with than the heart and other organs. So I think this accounts, really essentially desperation is what accounts for the willingness of psychiatry to take a good hard look. Now, they still want to see more test results. I get that. The drugs have not yet been approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the US or EMA in Europe. But I think that's coming. And because the trials have gone very well, particularly for MDMA in the treatment of trauma, but also psilocybin in the treatment of depression and OCD, and that I think that these results will justify approval by the regulators. Whether it will also justify a reimbursement by the insurers, whether the national health and the I was going to say equivalents, but we don't have an equivalent. But we have private health insurers, but we do have the government in Medicare and Medicaid. Whether they will see fit to approve payment for psychedelic therapy is one of the big questions.
And psychedelics do have the potential to have a big impact, although caveat being that at the same time, very important not to be taken lightly. And we can get onto that. But it's interesting what you were saying there about your confidence that this is going to keep moving forward. And I read somewhere that researchers in this field talk about pre and post pollen in terms of your impact. Is that right?
I've heard that phrase, and I think what the book did in this country certainly is remove a lot of the stigma that was attached to psychedelics, which were really regarded as these counterculture drugs that had caused all sorts of social upheaval, and a shift in viewing them as potential medicine. And that's a big deal. And I think the book helped tell that story, but it wasn't me. It was really the patients in the book and hearing their stories, hearing stories of profound transformation over the course of a single day, which is, just never happens. And so I think it's really those stories that captured the public's interest and then created a more hospitable environment for the research to go on. And indeed, funding opened up. Now the National Institute of Health, which does most of the medical funding in America, had never touched psychedelics in modern times. Now they're actually giving grants and soliciting proposals. So, the field had been supported by private philanthropists, a lot of people in the Bay Area especially, but not only there, also, hedge fund people in New York. And it's very unusual to have a field of medicine be primarily developed through private philanthropy rather than government funding. But that was the reality, and that had to do with the stigma. So I think that psychedelics are becoming more respectable, and if I had something to do with that, I'm happy to have.
Yeah. And obviously, you've got your book, How to Change Your Mind, but not everyone, likes to read a book which has the word science on the front. And so I think the fact that you've taken it into the world of Netflix as well, which is obviously opening up to this whole new audience and had a profound impact in my own house with my own family. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's the second episode where you focus on psilocybin. And I can't remember the guy's name, 30-something chap.
Ben,
Ben.
yes, the guy with OCD.
That was one of the most moving pieces of television I've ever seen, because you see this chap, his life is, he's tormented by OCD. One session or one day on psilocybin, and it utterly transformed his life.
Yeah, it's the most incredible story, and his emotion on the screen is so powerful. I mean, there's this sense of liberation that he has from these habits that really were wrecking his life, and making it difficult for him to connect with his young child, and this all dissolved, and he just kind of let it go. It's a remarkable story. In fact, we just heard from the researcher at Yale who's running that study that he was in. And since the Netflix thing came out, they've had 600 people apply to be in that trial, which is pretty remarkable. So yeah, I think his story is one of the most moving I've ever seen around this, and it has to do with the fact that it was so immediate and lasting. So that gives me, there's enormous hope there. And apparently that study has not been published yet, but from everything I hear, the results have been pretty spectacular.
Yeah, and like you say, the emotion that he displayed on screen, I mean, he was weeping, but tears of joy
Yeah.
from what he had experienced. I mentioned pre and post Pollan. He talked about his life pre the experience with psilocybin and post the experience with psilocybin. And that particular episode, one of four, but that particular episode, I got my mum to watch it, and she's like, right. She says, like, when my time is coming, I want some mushrooms. I'm not going to tell you what my answer was. And so the Netflix series was so profound, but I think it begs the question, because obviously we've got How to Change Your Mind. We've also got Your Mind on Plants, which obviously focuses more on opium, caffeine, mescaline. So let's zoom out a little bit. What are drugs? So for many people, they have that idea drugs are bad. And really, they've got quite a narrow view of what drugs are.
Right.
My wife was very much like this. She would bunch psilocybin in with things like cocaine, heroin even.
Heroin, yeah.
And then it was only after watching your Netflix series, I mean, she's done a complete 180. But the irony is, people might have that view, oh, drugs are bad, and they'll have that conversation while sipping coffee, completely unaware that that's
right.
a psychoactive drug.
Which is precisely why I wanted to include a very routine legal drug like caffeine, which 90% of adults around the world have a daily relationship with. It's quite extraordinary. But of course, we never think of it as a drug. It's a beverage. But no, it's a drug. So drugs are substances, chemicals you take into your body that changes us. Although as soon as you say that, you realize, well, doesn't food do that? I mean, sugar does that. So is sugar a drug? It's very hard to draw the line. And in fact, in the US, the Food and Drug Administration basically defines drugs as things that aren't food that we say are drugs. So it's a completely unsatisfying definition. And I wanted to complicate people's thinking about it. We all take drugs of one kind or another. And this desire to change consciousness in some way appears to be a human universal. Why is a really interesting question that I set out to explore in this book, but everybody does it. Kids do it. Kids do it when they spin and make themselves dizzy, or when they go on swings, or when they consume sugar. That is the cocaine of the
Yeah.
under five set. And I mean, if you've got kids, that you can kind of like what to expect when you give them a shot of sugar. And so people have fallen into this idea that drugs are things that are illegal and are a public health menace. Well, if you look at the history, there was a time when the drugs we consider really evil were very routine. In America, there were patent medicines. During the time of Prohibition, when you had these women like Carrie Nation, fighting alcohol, they would kick back with potions that had both cannabis and opium in them.
That's amazing.
And they didn't think anything of it. So it's very relative category. At various times, all societies have had some drug that they don't call a drug and they celebrate, but is a consciousness changing substance, and then others that they condemn. And it's constant. The identity of these drugs is changing. And of course, there are parts of the world where, caffeine is in the Arab world is a very important drug, partly because they don't have use of alcohol, or not officially anyway. And so, here alcohol's fine. Caffeine, there was even attempts to ban coffee at the beginning, believe it or not, in the Arab world. And then in England, too. Charles II tried to ban the coffee houses because he didn't like the kind of conversation that was happening there. It was a very political conversation. So there's always a set of kind of socio-political reasons why one drug is celebrated and the other is not. I think that there's a certain kind of economic determinism in this. I think certain drugs grease the wheels of the machine, of society, of capitalism, and coffee and tea are definitely in that category. They make us better workers, and so it's not surprising that these are celebrated in our culture. And then there are other drugs that are seen as disruptive in one way or another. Cannabis is changing its identity in the US, but that was a big part of the drug war for many years. And people, on cannabis don't work very hard. And they don't consume very much either. They're very happy staring at like whatever's in front of them without having to buy something new. So capitalism has been kind of hostile to cannabis until it figured out how it could make a lot of money off it, which is what's happening now in North America. So anyway, I just wanted to relativize people's understanding of drugs and take a second look and re-examine their relationship to drugs, including coffee and tea. And I don't mean to be critical of coffee and tea. I mean, I'm a big fan. I'm drinking tea right now, and I have coffee every morning, and I'm a proud addict. But I just think that we should explore that relationship. Like, what are we getting out of this? Why are we into consciousness change? One of the most amazing facts about coffee that I learned was the fact that, and this tells you all you need to know about it. Well, there's a couple amazing facts. That research was really eye-opening. But one is, think about a drug that your boss, your employer gives you. They give you free drugs, and then they give you time in which to ingest them, called the coffee break. How amazing! Like, why are they doing that? Well, they're gaining more from the act than they're not. Obviously, it makes you more productive. That lag in the afternoon when your productivity goes down, it lifts. So it's I think coffee and tea have been handmaidens to the Industrial Revolution and to capitalism in general. Hard to imagine without coffee and tea.
No, absolutely, yes, yeah. It's you really sort of paint a stark picture of how capitalism and coffee have really run side by side, and without
Yeah.
coffee, would the world look very, very different? I mean, that's the big question. But here's one I want to.
And I think the answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, the thing to understand is before coffee and tea come to England and France, and this is in the 1650s. I mean, they both appear.
Everyone was sloshed, weren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, people were drinking all the time, and in fact, if you did outdoor physical labor, they had beer breaks. They gave you beer just to keep you going. But you can't operate heavy machinery when you're drunk, or you can't do double entry bookkeeping. I mean, there's certain functions of a modern economy that don't happen when you're drunk.
Which is why I think it's interesting the rise of psychedelics at this time, at this juncture in human history. And I want to dive into that. But here's a question for you, Michael. If I'd have asked your view of psychedelic drugs, say 15, 20 years ago, to what degree would your answer have been shaped by the drug war and the beliefs that have sort of filtered down through the generations, right through to my wife, as I mentioned, unwittingly, uncritically? To what degree were they part of your belief system?
Completely. I mean, I thought they were really scary substances. I never used them when I was young. I never took a psychedelic when I was in college or in teenage years. I just thought I had absorbed all the kind of propaganda that these were destroyers of young minds, that you would have a trip that you'd never come back from, that you might have a psychotic break. The whole image of people taking LSD and jumping off of buildings or staring at the sun till they went blind, that was my reality too. I had no reason to doubt it. So it was a kind of a surprise and a revelation to me when I learned that this scary substance that I'd been, avoiding my whole life was being used to treat mental illness, not create it. That was kind of mind blowing, and it really was when I read about those studies going on at Johns Hopkins University and New York University to give psychedelics to people with terminal cancer diagnoses, which on its face seemed crazy to me. Like, is this what you'd want to do if you were faced with that kind of diagnosis? And the idea that they could have such a positive, transformative experience. It's a reminder, though, that all drugs are very much a product of circumstance and setting and how they are, to what purpose are they being put. And so that reframing of psychedelics as a potential therapy, that took me by surprise, and it obviously took my readers by surprise. And that's the shift that's underway. It's not to say that everything we were told about psychedelics in the backlash that really begins around 1965 is false. There are people who have psychotic breaks. There are accidents. There are risks involved. They're mostly psychological risks, but there are real risks involved. These risks are mitigated to a large extent when the drugs are given in this highly controlled environment of a clinical trial with two guides sitting with you the whole time, and careful preparation and integration after. But people still have, really scary trips. And the idea of a bad trip, that was part of what kept me away, is not a myth. I mean, that happens. I think if you're being guided properly, the bad trip can be very productive. You can learn a lot from it, but it can be terrifying even so.
Yeah. I've been interested in psychedelics and their potential for healing, as well as insights, for a long time. And my familiarity with them led me to do a TV news piece for the BBC back in 2016 on the possible pros and cons of ayahuasca specifically. And what is very clear to me is the importance of integration after the experience. Because if you don't properly integrate what you experience with someone who knows how to help you integrate what you've experienced, it can be
Destabilizing.
a terrifying experience and even dangerous.
Yeah. So I think, and that is one of my big worries, is that what we're hearing, all the positive press about psychedelics, is leading more and more people to use them, but they're not always using them in the best circumstance. They're not getting that kind of careful preparation, somebody there to mitigate any risk during the experience, making sure they don't get up and go somewhere, walk out into traffic, whatever it is. And then, most important, yes, integrating the experience, because it's a very confusing and destabilizing kind of experience, and you need some help making sense of it. And figuring out, what does this have to do with your everyday life? Because you're going to go back to your everyday life. And what did you actually learn? What lessons can you apply? And that takes some very skillful therapy. And it doesn't have to be a professional. I've found my wife is like the most effective integrator of my experiences. I mean, every time I've done this, when I was doing the research for the book, I would come home after and tell her that we'd have dinner, and I'd tell her the whole story of what happened. And she'd very carefully, she knows me really well. We've been together since we were like kids, basically. She would say, "Oh, this connects to that. That's all about your dad. That's about this anxiety." And, suddenly what was this chaos of experience started to make some sense. And it's about turning it into a narrative, also a useful narrative. So yeah, I encourage anyone who's thinking of doing this to make sure they have a good guide and somebody who can help them. And because the other thing that comes out of being in a very well regulated environment with somebody you trust, a guide or a shaman, is that you can really let go. And I think that's really important, to surrender to the experience. To the extent you fight what's going on in your head as you feel yourself dying or going crazy or melting or all the different things that happen to people, if you fight that and you cling to that ego to hold on to it, that's when you're going to get really anxious and paranoid. If there's this push pull between the medicine and you, if you succumb and just surrender to what's happening, I'm dying, I'm going to let it happen, I'm going to open that doorway, I'm going to go into that cave, whatever it is, or I'm going to embrace that monster coming at me, you will be much better off, and it will morph into a very positive experience. And that is hard to remember in the midst of it, but a good preparation will tell you, and a good guide will say, surrender to what's happening.
Yeah.
Relax your mind and float downstream, as John Lennon put it.
Absolutely. I mean, actually, I think that's a good way of approaching pretty much all of our internal experience. We're so used to avoiding and suppressing and denying and all that and distracting with our phones. Actually, surrendering to what is in the given moment, it's one of the best approaches to certainly our internal life.
Totally agree. And it is also the same lesson of meditation, right? Mindfulness is, don't fight what's going on in your head. Just watch it go by and let it go by, and surrender.
You mentioned the ego and melting and dying and all that kind of stuff. And you had a nice line, I think, in the book where you talk about, I'd always felt identical to my ego, and which is the default state for
most of us, yeah.
For 99%, certainly of Western society. We think the ego is who we are.
Yeah.
And then you go into and you do this experience. And in your case, the ego gets blown into, what was it, billions
Post-it
or
notes.
Thousands of blue Post-it notes.
Blue Post-it notes, a whole detonation of self into Post-it notes that then kind of, fell like snow to the floor and formed this pool of blue paint. And that was me. That was my ego. I survived the death of the ego. And that tells you something, that it tells you you're not identical. There is some space between you, that there is a self that is not egotistical, because the self from which I observe this experience, this catastrophe, you might say, was completely cool with it. It was fine. It was, perfect equanimity. And that gave me this sense that I didn't have to listen to my ego all the time, that it was one voice, an important voice. It helped me get a lot of things done, but it wasn't me. Or there was another me that was less grasping, less selfish, less self-interested. And that was, that stayed with me. That's really stayed with me. That was a very important insight. And that could have been a frightening experience, watching yourself, because that was me. That puddle on the ground was what was left of me. But I had a very good guide, and she had prepared me for this. And I was able to let go and observe it with this incredible objectivity.
Yeah. Two questions then. First of all, just briefly on that, the fact that so many people who've been given a terminal diagnosis have gone through psychedelic therapy and it's given them a sense of peace about dying. How closely related is that to the death of the ego and the fact that there is something, like you say, that's totally cool with it, that's left standing? So that's part one. And then, Michael, part two, if you can just talk as well about what you've learned about the relationship between the ego and the default mode network in the brain.
Yeah. So with regard to the people who were struggling with cancer, having an experience of ego dissolution, I think, was very important to changing their mindset. They One of the things that happens is when your ego dissolves, you feel less separate from other things. The ego builds walls, right? It's a defensive structure in large part, and when those walls come down, you merge with whatever is larger than you, and you feel very connected to the natural world, to other people. And many of the people who describe their experiences, the cancer patients, would talk about feeling like part of nature, part of the soil. I went into the soil and I was taken up by the plants, and that there was there was a kind of afterlife, and you know, not necessarily as conscious beings, but they were incorporated in something larger than themselves. So they saw their death less as an end than as part of a process. Many of them, and that was enormously reassuring to people. Some of them had very specific sense of what would happen after they died. They would talk about a great plane of consciousness stretching out indefinitely that they would join. That I think the death of the ego, the fact that the death of the ego does not obliterate you and you still have some perspective, suggests that something will survive the death of the ego. And it's sort of a death rehearsal. And many people come out of it feeling much more reassured, which I find fascinating. And, I would ask the researchers, so what are we, are you selling an illusion or delusion to people? And they would say, well, these are products of their own minds. Not everybody has these. And no, we're not selling them a delusion. This is what they're coming up with. And others would say, what's so bad about that? If it allows people to die with more equanimity. So you can regard that from several different perspectives. In terms of the default mode network and the ego, to the extent the ego has an address in the brain, it appears to be this particular network. This is a network. It's called default mode because it's very active when you're not doing anything else, when you're not on a task. It was kind of discovered when they were putting people in fMRI machines to look at brain function and correlate brain function with a subjective experience, that when you said, I just want a baseline, don't do anything, don't think about anything, this was the network that acted up. So it's kind of the default, it's where the brain goes. Involves a couple structures in the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and some deeper, older areas having to do with memory. But it's the part of the brain that appears to be involved in what's called theory of mind, our ability to imagine the perspective of other people, that other people are conscious, not just us, and also the narrative self, the story we construct moment by moment of who we are, and how we fold information and what happens to us into that story. It's also involved in time travel. And if you think about it, without a sense of past and future, you don't have an identity, right? I mean, identity is everything that's happened to you before and your objectives for the future. So it seems very involved with the construction of the ego and our sense of self. And what's really interesting is in some of the research done, and this is done by putting people in fMRI machines while they're tripping, and we should applaud these volunteers for being willing to do that, because I can't imagine, that their default mode network is deactivated substantially during the psychedelic experience. And in fact, there were correlations between the degree to which the default mode network was silenced and the degree to which people had what's called a mystical experience, which is that experience of transcending the sense of self and becoming part of something larger. So if you can get the default mode network offline, you're going to have that feeling of what's called unitive consciousness, that you're part of something larger. You're not defended by this thing called the ego. And you can get there other ways. Mystical experience is achievable through meditation and fasting and vision quests. There's a whole history in the West and the East of transcending self. And probably these are all technologies for quieting the default mode network.
And actually, even more mundane stuff. I mean, I talk about sport, people talk about flow.
Yeah.
In the flow, you're not thinking about past and future. You're just part of the universal flow.
You're there. You're in the present.
Pretty much any time.
And you're not thinking about ego either.
Yeah.
You're so absorbed in the task that you're not judging. Am I doing well? Am I doing badly? What do people think of what I'm doing and how I look? No, you're in it.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if this research has been done, but I would guess that during states of flow, the default mode network is deactivated.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've spoken to plenty of people who say that during a seminal or key moment, of sporting heroism, they said there was no me present. There was just a knowing of it, which is the same as in that psychedelic experience. There was the knowing of those blue Post-it notes for you, and those blue Post-it notes were the me, weren't they? I mean, that's it, right?
That's it.
And the default mode network, and you say, when people are sort of sat there not thinking about anything else, and they're very associated, are they not, with self-referential thoughts?
Oh, yeah.
I.e., you alluded to them. What do people think of me? Or how am I doing? Blah, blah, blah. All that kind of stuff where we're the star of our own movie.
Yeah. No, the default mode network is definitely involved in self-reflection. And self-reflection is really kind of what goes away in flow states and in psychedelic states and in meditative states. I mean, meditation is all about transcending that sense of self and being part of a kind of more universal consciousness.
And you said people being fooled, oh, is this just a trick of my mind? Now, someone like Aldous Huxley and various other people I've spoken to, Bernardo Kastrup, various other people, would not say my mind, they would say mind, as in mind at large. And I want to talk to you about spotlight attention and wide open awareness, but I have a question for you, Michael, which is that at the end of How to Change Your Mind, you say the following sentence, which reads as follows. I've marked it down. I still tend to think that consciousness must be confined to brains, but I'm less certain of this belief now than I was before I embarked on this journey. At the end of your Netflix series, you talk about the mystery of the emergence from matter of something as miraculous as consciousness, and you've described yourself as a default physical materialist. Okay, so if your belief in being a default physical materialist, i.e. someone who believes that experience comes from matter. Matter is the fundamental building blocks of the universe, of reality, and then from that comes experience. If you were a 10 out of 10 20 years ago, and let's say you were 8 out of 10 in 2018, where are you at now?
Probably 6 or 7.
Oh, so you're still on that side.
I mean, I've read Bernardo Kastrup, and I find it very compelling up to a certain point. I mean, I fully accept his idea that everything we think of as matter is a product of consciousness, and that we would have no understanding of it. No, we can't even frame space-time without consciousness. So the idea that there's this pristine world existing outside of human perception, I don't know what it is. There's something out there. But the more I learn about animal senses, the more I realize that we have a very partial view of reality. We have the reality that these particular 5 senses can construct. And, bees have a very different reality because they can see in a spectrum of light we can't. So do they live in a different world or the same world viewed differently? That's a very active question for me. But I don't know how you get from that truth that everything we know is already filtered through consciousness. There is no consciousness-free perception of the world. And that includes our telescopes, all our instruments, which are human instruments, products of consciousness, choosing to, on the Webb telescope, look at this particular spectrum of light, and that's the world it constructs. How do you get from there to the idea there is one consciousness that we are a alter of, or a slice of? That's the step in Kastrup I don't yet follow.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I've really dived into this. What's interesting, what you said there is you can't quite, reconcile how to get from there to there. The thing I can't reconcile is how you get from a piece of, I think you've described it, grey tofu,
Yeah.
to the richness of experience. Whereas to me, I think, not necessarily Bernardo, but some of the other people I've spoken to, Donald Hoffman or Rupert Spira, who talking about, okay, for me, the easy way to understand it is like a dream at night. In the dream, there's you, there might be my wife, and there might be our house. So there's subject, object, world. And then you wake up and you realize that no, they were all localizations within mind. To me, you just scale that up ad infinitum, and it makes
Oh, that's interesting.
it's like this little clue given by reality. Whereas the hard
But
problem of
whose dream is it?
no one's, it's infinite consciousness's dream within itself. I mean, look, these are questions that the human mind can't answer, right?
Probably.
Or can't necessarily grapple with. We're not as clever as we like to think we are.
But we need to be more open-minded than we are, because
Yeah.
clearly the way we're approaching this problem is not working.
No.
We are no closer to a materialist understanding of consciousness than we were when we started this.
Well, there's the hard problem, isn't there? And the hard problem is a bit of a misleading title, because basically what it's really saying, it's not hard. It's saying it's the impossible problem.
Yeah.
Is it not?
Yeah, it should be called the impossible problem. Although David Chalmers, who coined that term, thinks we have a 20% chance or so of solving it. I don't know where he gets that, but he does think that there is some percentage that we can. But I mean, you could also argue it's only hard because of the way it's been framed. It's a very Cartesian idea that we're looking at mind, soul as something separate, and physicality as something separate, and that's the thing we're trying to bridge. But maybe that's a mistake.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's a really challenging subject to think about, and I'm definitely giving a lot of thought. And like you, it is psychedelics that puts the problem in front of you. Many of us go through life not really thinking about consciousness and what an extraordinary phenomenon it is. And what is it? Is it stuff? No. Is it a process? Possibly. I don't even think we have a good, definition. But the other way to attack it, though, is instead of starting with human consciousness, which is a very hard problem, because there's not just consciousness but self-consciousness, that we can turn our attention on ourselves. This is a very weird phenomenon. But what about animal consciousness? What about plant consciousness? Maybe we should be looking for the simplest version of consciousness and build up from there, rather than start with the hardest case and work down.
Something I find interesting about consciousness is that if we're looking for the simplest thing, actually, to me, if you take consciousness, it is the simplest thing, which is just that it exists and it's aware. And on that basis, if you just take those two attributes, shall we say, or characteristics, then the consciousness in me is no different than the consciousness in my cat or the consciousness in a bee. That consciousness, as defined in that way, it is and it's aware, boom, end of. That means it could be, first of all, fundamental and primary, and second of all, the same in all of us and everything.
Yeah, but it's the same like we all have breath. I mean, so I don't have an answer to this question. Invite me back in a few years.
Let's then just slightly, we're staying on the similar path, but just change focus back to the ego, though, because you've spoken about this like this defensive mechanism, and it's judgmental, it lives in time, and it separates you from me and me from world and all that kind of thing. To what degree do you think the widespread propensity to identify with our egos is linked to things like tribalism, mental health, conflict, materialism, all the kind of modern maladies, if you like?
Yeah, well, because it others things, right? I mean, it sees self and other, a subject, object, all this opposition. It's a binary way of looking at the world, whereas the kind of ego dissolution people experience on psychedelics tends to make them see consciousness as shared, because everything is shared. There are no walls, and so you have this sense of my mind is your mind and everybody's mind. And I had this experience after that ego dissolution that I described with the exploding post-it notes. I had this sense of merging with this Yo-Yo Ma recording of Bach's cello suite number 2 in D minor, which was playing on the in my headphones. And I was indistinguishable both from Yo-Yo Ma and from this instrument and from the waves of sound emanating from inside it. I was it. There was a total, mind meld there. And so I do think the ego as a construction of the mind or projection of the mind certainly encourages a certain interpretation of consciousness as very separate and therefore and material. That it's my consciousness. It comes out of this gray matter, not that I'm absorbing stuff from the ether. And you referred earlier to Huxley, and he believed that that consciousness was like radio waves, that we kind of received them. We were tuners. And in the same way you wouldn't look in the TV set to find the woman giving the weather report, she's not there. You're not going to find consciousness looking in the brain.
Yeah.
But it's being, beamed into us. And that we have and there's a filter, and it allows more or less consciousness to come in. That was Huxley's take, and it was, some of the phenomenologist philosophers' take too. And William James's take to a large extent. It's called the filter theory of consciousness.
Yeah.
And who knows? I mean, there may be something to it. I mean, we may learn, things that encourage us to believe that's the case. But I'm not quite there yet. And that's just my, I grew up in this culture that, where science was going from one triumph to another, and science was telling us, of course, the brain produces consciousness. But they've been wrong about a lot of things.
Yeah. Don Hoffman says a lovely thing, which is, the theories we hold as sacred now will look back in 100 years and be like, what a load of nonsense, just as we did. Although the perennial philosophy, anyway, but that's a separate thing. But
well, his theory is very interesting too. I mean, he basically says we have a user interface. That's all we're dealing with. And Darwin, evolution did not evolve us to have an accurate take on reality.
Yeah,
it evolved us to have an effective take on reality. Now, at certain points, those coincide. It seems to me that the more accurate your understanding of reality, the more you're likely to succeed, but not in all instances. And he thinks even space-time is just a human construct.
Yeah. Well, he says it's dead in the water, doesn't he?
Yes, I know. with such confidence that
I know. Yeah. It's amazing.
I don't know what the evidence is. I mean, it's provocative.
Well, science was never my thing at school, so I
me neither.
Yeah.
I didn't study science until I became a journalist.
No, and I think that's good though, because there isn't that kind of identity and that clinging to things in that same way. You're just exploring and learning as you go, and I think that really comes through in your work. But just you had that, the ego death, and you were like, crikey, that those post-it notes aren't all of me. So, there's been a lot of talk about how psychedelics can be really effective in so many different cases. So, for example, it might be OCD or different addictions, or, even down to low self-esteem, for example. And the ego death side of things, or transcending the ego, seems to play a big part in that. And if psychedelic therapy sort of keeps rolling on as it is with the work that you're doing and training up people to be as sitters and help with integration and that kind of thing, I'm interested to see what you think. If more people experience, not just read, but experience that their ego is not fundamentally who they are, what a transformative impact that could have on the way we live our lives, not just from a mental health point of view, but as you say, the normal neurotic.
Society-wide.
Yeah.
So, this is a big question and a big debate in the field of psychedelics. There is some preliminary evidence to suggest that there's belief change that comes out of these experiences. And we have seen that, there's a study done at Imperial College that people after a single psilocybin experience greater sense of connection to nature. They feel they're more part of nature rather than standing outside nature. Less tolerance for authoritarian behavior. It all seems to push people in what at least progressives and people on the left would think is a positive direction. I don't think we can say that yet with confidence. I think, and the reason is that I think most of the people who are in these trials tend to already have those inclinations, and that they are environmentalists and they are, believers in democracy rather than authoritarianism. And until we actually try those experiments and those surveys on people across the political spectrum, giving psilocybin to the Koch brothers, say, or people like that who are not well disposed to the environment and are committed to fossil fuels, let's see if they change their beliefs. It could be that psychedelics reinforce beliefs we already have, deep beliefs, or it could be that it changes them. And I think that's a really important research question. Certainly before
What's
we.
your hunch on that, Michael? Because in my experience and from people I know and everything like that, it forces you to be humble. It can bring you to your knees. So, I mean, what is your hunch on which side? What, reinforce or shake up beliefs on those guys?
I think shake up, but I think the shaking up has to do with, again, the context and and how, the intention people have when they're doing it, the set and the setting. I think in general, I mean, I share your belief that egotistical thinking is at the root of a lot of our problems, including the environmental crisis. If you feel separate from nature, if you feel you're the only subject that really counts, you're going to feel pretty good about killing other things and having your way with nature. I'm very interested in the belief change around animism. There's some really interesting research that's been done at Johns Hopkins that shows that people are much more likely to see plants as conscious, even objects as conscious, after a single psilocybin trip, and that attributing of consciousness is kind of a sharing of your ego. I mean, opening up the gates and joining hands with other entities. So, to the extent that egotistical thinking is at the root of a lot of our problems, and this subject-object duality, and this, where the object is an object and is subject to our manipulation, even when it's the object is other people, anything that softens egos is probably taking us in the right direction. With the proviso, however, that we have many cases of people who take psychedelics and undergo incredible ego inflation.
Really?
So what's that about? Why does that happen? I mean, think of Timothy Leary. There's a whole tradition of people whose ego kind of got out of control on psychedelics. And some of that is a very evangelical instinct. They sort of feel like, oh my God, I've got the key to the universe. I understand everything. Come listen to me. So more research needs to be done. I know people hate that answer, but it's absolutely true, and it's fascinating research. And I'm involved with some of it at Berkeley. We've started a psychedelic research. Yeah,
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you. Yeah, I know you're at the forefront of it. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not conducting the research, but I'm working with these scientists and helping to raise money for this work. And we're going to look at belief change and see if we can't come up with some experiments that'll give us some better answers. But the answers are really intriguing and encouraging. I just think we're not quite there yet to say this is true.
Sure, sure. And I want to ask you just in a second, just about where we're at in terms of the work you're doing at Berkeley. But is it? I find it interesting. Just a quick statement, as much as anything else. Putting aside the Timothy Learys of the world, but let's just say, okay, often it's ego debilitating. It's interesting that psychedelic research interest is rising just at the time when ego deification through things like Instagram is also rising.
Yes.
It's like it's the antidote to such a big problem, particularly amongst young people. But yeah, in terms of, so I know you co-founded the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. I saw as well, I'm not entirely sure, is it decriminalized in Oregon or?
No, it's actually been state legalized.
State legalized. Okay.
In Oregon, it's an awkward phrase, state legal, because it's still illegal federally at the national level. But in Oregon, beginning the end of this year, January 1, you will be able to get guided psilocybin experience from guides that are trained or at least licensed by the state, with mushrooms that have been grown under license by the state. They're still in the midst of figuring out all the rules of the road here because it's very complicated. And but that is the case. And Colorado has passed a similar law and will modeled on Oregon. So at some time fairly soon there will be state legal psychedelics there too. And it's, you see these states and municipalities moving faster than the government to legalize this. It's going to be it could end up being a real shit show. It's going to be hard to do right. How do you deal with liability issues? How do you deal with banking issues? When it's still a federal crime. I think they gave themselves 2 years to design the whole regulatory regime, and I think they're struggling to get it done in time because there's so many complicated issues. And what constitutes someone qualified to be a guide? What do you need? Do you need a license? As a therapist of one kind or another, or can you be more like a sitter? How much training do you need? All these questions have to be sorted out.
So how's it all going in terms of the centre that you co-founded then, in terms of training sitters? Where are you at compared to 5 years ago? Where are you going to be in 5 years? What's the state of play? Because we're 10
Yeah.
years behind. Generally speaking, in the UK, we're always 10 years behind everything in America. So this is 2033 we're looking at here.
Okay. Well, at the center, we're just about to start research. We're getting our permissions from the government and the IRB, the research boards at the university, to do basic science. We're not doing therapeutic work. We're going to be really trying to understand the mechanisms by which psychedelics work. We have some very powerful fMRI technology that hasn't been used in the field ever before. So we're going to get a better sense of what's going on in the brain when people have a psychedelic experience. And we're studying perception and belief change and things like that. But we're doing two other interesting things too. We're training guides. We just started our first cohort this fall, and we're devising a training program that we hope will be a model for other institutions. And we're working with people who are already licensed in some therapeutic modality. They might be, psychiatric social workers or psychologists or doctors. And we've got a strong group going through that program right now. And then we're doing a big public education piece. And that's the piece I'm most involved with. We have a free newsletter on Substack called The Microdose. Comes out twice a week. We're doing a journalistic fellowship. We're giving money to journalists who have good ideas to write about psychedelics, because we're really trying to grow a cadre of journalists who can cover this field with sophistication and hold it accountable, because it's going to get messy. I mean, there's such a flood of money coming into it. It's a real gold rush, and there's some unscrupulous operators that are going to pop up.
Yeah, there are venture capitalists circling, aren't there?
Yeah, and a tremendous amount of investment, yet no one has figured out the business model yet. So
Yeah.
there's going to be a big shakeout too, I think. So we want to cover that. We want to cover the business story, the policy story, the personal story, the neuroscience story, and I'm very excited about that work because they're beginning to be this group of journalists for whom this is their beat and will be their beat for many years to come.
Absolutely, and it's such an exciting area, not just in terms of mental health, but consciousness, ego. I mean, the potential ramifications are absolutely huge. So I just want to finish by again just saying, How to Change Your Mind, the book, fundamental or crucial reading. But if you're not one for books, go and watch it on Netflix, because that's very, very good too. And then This Is Your Mind on Plants. And then all your books on writing, writing on eating, writing. Well, I'm sure you do that as well. I know what you're like. But listen, I can't speak highly enough of your work. Like I said, I'm so pleased to get to chat to you, Michael. But you've touched on a few things there. Anything else you want to say in terms of your website? Because I know you've got resources coming out of your ears. So spread the word.
Well, I'm trying to make information on this as available freely as possible. So psychedelics.berkeley.edu is a very good resources website where you can learn about the risks and the benefits of psychedelics, and sign up for the Microdose newsletter if you want to get a free newsletter twice a week, which will keep you up to date on what's happening in the field. And then my own website, michaelpollan.com, has all my articles for free. You can download them, and also has a whole resource page about psychedelics. If you're thinking of this might be for you or for someone you know, it's got a whole lot of resources about that. So I sort of see that as part of my mission now, is get the information out there, because there still is a lot of misconception about that and a lot of fear. And it's not that I'm encouraging people to do this, but there are a lot of people struggling with mental health problems, and for some of them, this could be the answer.
And I know I saw on Twitter you're off to Australia to do a speaking talk. When are you coming to the UK again, Michael, again?
I was there last July.
I know.
I don't know when I'll come back. I mean, I always love coming to London, especially in the summer.
Well, come back and do some talks.
All right.
And if you need someone to sit there with a microphone, I'll do it for free.
I can't imagine someone I'd enjoy doing that with more. Really, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Simon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Life Lessons podcast with Michael Pollan. I'll link to his books and Netflix series in the show notes, and I can't recommend them enough. And I'll also link to my BBC News report about ayahuasca specifically. Now, psychedelic research is clearly a growing and interesting area and does have the potential to help a lot of people who are suffering, but clearly they are not to be taken lightly. Psychedelics are extremely powerful substances that must be treated with respect. And that's why the work that is taking place in various universities and medical institutions around the world to explore how people can explore psychedelic therapy safely is so important. If you found this episode interesting and useful, please do share it, as it does make a big difference. And there is a link to share this episode on my website, simonmundy.com. And while you're there, you can drop me an email if you want with any questions or thoughts you may have. And that's it for now. I'll be back with a bite-sized episode this Friday and another full-length episode next week.